All right, and now we are at our last panel of the day, which focuses on engineering access to data and algorithms, and will be moderated by the Knight Institute's very own litigation director, Alex Abdo. Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good afternoon, all. We're delighted to have you here with us in our final panel of the symposium. And our panel is titled Engineering Access to Data and Algorithms. And our goal for the next 90 minutes is to explore ways of better understanding so that we can perhaps better rein in the algorithmic processes that today determine so much about public and private life, from the posts that you see in your social media feeds to the distribution of public benefits like welfare or unemployment, to the use by police departments of facial recognition technology or by parole officers of software to determine your likelihood of recidivism. These processes surround us, but we don't understand them very well, and still less do we understand the impact that they're having on society, on public discourse, on existing inequalities, and so much more. And there are many questions. Do algorithmic prioritizations of our news feeds on social media promote the spread of disinformation and hate? Does algorithmic targeting of housing or employment ads discriminate against communities of color? Have the efforts of the social media companies to stem the flood of misinformation around COVID-19 or other topics of political debate actually worked? So the motivation for this panel is that we may need answers to these questions, but we don't have a reliable way of getting them. But fortunately, we have three excellent and thought-provoking essays and their authors, as well as an outside commenter to help us explore these questions. And before turning it over to them, I want to tell you just a little bit about how the panel is going to work. We have 90 minutes, and in a minute, I'll turn it over to the first of our authors to present her essay for 5 to 7 minutes, and each will get a turn to do just that, to present their essays for 5 to 7 minutes. And I'll then ask our commenter, Evelyn Dueck, to offer her thoughts, to sum up the essays however she feels appropriate, and then we'll launch into a conversation. And more than anything, I'm hoping that we'll have an interesting and engaging conversation. We'll save about 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Please feel free to send your questions at any point, though, throughout the panel. I'll be monitoring them, and if I can sprinkle them in earlier into the conversation, I will. But I'll remind you all in about an hour or so to add some more questions to the Q&A box. And you should be able to see it in the bottom of your Zoom box. There's a little icon that just says Q&A. I'm going to give very brief introductions of our panelists before each one speaks. You can find more extensive bios for them on the symposium website, which you can get to by going to knightcolumbia.org. But up first will be Hannah Block-Webba. She's an associate professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law. And we're delighted to have you. Hannah, take it away.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you to Amy and Katie and everybody at Yale and at the Knight Institute who have made this fabulous event happen. So the public has grown aware that when AI is used in government, marginalized people and communities, people of color, the poor, the disabled, often are bearing the brunt of algorithmic unfairness, bias, and error. And in this paper, I'm starting from the assumption that the public demands and needs to know much more about how these tools and mechanisms are operating. So the question is really, how do our current legal protections and arrangements enable the public to get this information? And in my view, the answer is very unsatisfying. The law today just doesn't adequately provide this mechanism. And the reason isn't primarily that AI is simply too complex to be made transparent, but rather because of a well-known fault line in our transparency frameworks, which is that we lack a direct means of making private enterprise operate in public, even when it's working closely with the government. And if we want to fix this problem, if we want to put the power to know how AI works when the government uses it back into the people's hands, then we can't let private sector vendors define what transparency means and how it should operate. And yet I argue that's exactly what's happening. So our open government framework really imposes systemic obstacles to getting information about proprietary AI tools. Governments often obtain AI tools from private vendors. And this isn't always the case, of course, for the federal government, but at the state and local level, where municipal police departments and state welfare agencies are looking to automation for efficiency and cost savings reasons, contracting out is really prevalent. And the problem from a transparency perspective is that the Freedom of Information Act and other open government obligations don't directly reach the private vendors that usually supply these tools. So for example, when a vendor such as Palantir, the shadowy policing technology firm, licenses an AI-powered predictive policing tool to the government usually doesn't control many of the most meaningful records and can't make them public. And vendors have also resisted disclosure in this space, citing trade secrecy. On a broader level, I think, in an era of widespread privatization and contracting out of government functions, it's become apparent that while open government obligations facilitate and in some ways amplify negative scrutiny of the government and contribute to its hollowing out, the private sector has remained relatively free to conduct its business totally unmonitored by the public eye. And perhaps ironically, this has opened up space for technology firms to simultaneously resist open government disclosure-based models of transparency while embracing a rich parallel debate about how to make AI technically transparent. So how to make it provide reasons for decisions, to provide explanations to those who are affected, and to demonstrate to stakeholders that those decisions are reached in a way that's consistent, broadly speaking, with law and policy, all, of course, without jeopardizing trade secrecy, innovation, or profit. I have two key concerns about this move to redefine transparency in technical terms. The first is that by tailoring transparency obligations around proprietary rights, we've already given the game away. The technical definition of transparency simply just doesn't question the assumption that the law entitles companies to withhold much of the information that we need to understand what they're doing in the first place, even when these tools are used by governments. And my second concern, to refer back to a theme that's recurred throughout the contributions to this symposium, is that the dominant technical visions of transparency focus too heavily on individual rights and marginalize, by contrast, the value of democratic accountability and participatory governance. I think you could even argue that the private sector's insulation from transparency obligations is in some way an indirect subsidy for government contracts with private vendors. And I think there are two key ways of addressing this. So first, and most simply, governments shouldn't enter into contracts that propose to circumvent open records and disclosure obligations. And I think we see on a case-by-case basis and in states around the country, some moves in that direction. So for example, a federal court in Texas recently held that trade secrecy claims by a vendor that provided algorithmic assessments for teachers in Houston were irreconcilable with due process rights. And in Idaho, a recently enacted law provides that no builder or user of a pretrial risk assessment algorithm may assert trade secret or other protections in order to quash discovery. But I think it would be preferable to have clear ex ante guidelines that prohibit contracts that promote secrecy, rather than having to fight these battles after the fact. Second, I think that states should reform procurement law to allow governments to take into account values other than pricing when they contract for AI tools. So governments should be able to consider values such as commitments to openness when they enter into contracts. And we should consider embedding other ways of incentivizing openness, including by promoting open standards that themselves in turn are cognizant of transparency needs in the contracting process. So I think I will stop there and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was great. Up next is going to be a team of authors, but their paper will be presented by Jonathan Zitrain. I think just to let you all know in advance, I may refer to you as Team Giftschrank, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, just to make it easier, and the audience will understand why in a minute. But this next paper is authored by three people I'll introduce now, but again, Jonathan Zitrain will present it. He's the George Bemis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he is a professor of computer science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. His co-authors are Elaine Sedenberg, who you'll see a little bit later. She leads global research and academic engagement for Facebook's privacy and data policy team and is an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And the final co-author is John Bowers, who is also an affiliate at Berkman Klein and a JD candidate at Yale Law School. But for now, we'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Alex, and hello, everybody. It might be helpful just to pick up on some of Hannah's themes from the talk she just gave, where she pointed out all of the data going into things like risk algorithms in the criminal justice system may be awfully hard to access for the purpose of auditing those algorithms if they're in the hands of private companies and they don't want to turn it over. And at the very least, within the criminal justice system, the outputs are known. The inputs may be kind of recondite, as with these algorithms, shielded by the private companies, but there's at least some nominal sense that decisions that get made in the system ought to be public. We ought to know if somebody is acquitted or convicted or released on bail or not. When we turn to the topic that comes and goes when we think of algorithmic implementation of things at scale, specifically about content moderation, the decisions themselves may not be available. So when we're thinking about data and democracy, it might not just be data as input to some model that then gets used, but data as output. The decisions of the algorithms are data too, and that may be something that's really important for the public or its representatives to understand. And I've at times likened machine learning to asbestos. It's the kind of thing that's invisibly installed as part of a larger product. It's very useful, and it can become hugely pervasive without anybody deciding overall that it's time for it to become ubiquitous. And like asbestos, it's loaded with latent dangers and hard to reverse once it's in place. And with those circumstances obtaining, it might be really important to have a chance to understand what these algorithms are doing at scale. And it's not a bad time in content moderation to be thinking about it, or in other forms of decision-making that social media platforms across the board are undertaking, because they're becoming much more active in intervening in the flow of information across their platforms from third parties. What previously might have been a First Amendment style by choice ceiling on the decisions they'd make is increasingly becoming a bunch of decisions that, if made by the US government, would immediately run afoul of First Amendment issues. And just statistically speaking, from their transparency reports, we know from Facebook that 2 years ago, 2018, in the second quarter, they took action on 2.5 million pieces of content for violating hate speech guidelines. Second quarter of this year, 22.5 million pieces of content. And Twitter has a similar massive increase in its handling of such things. And that's against a backdrop of other decisions, like removing something because it's spammy. I remember the 2018 New York Times article observing that one of the platforms had taken action on 865 million pieces of content. So with things that ubiquitous, it would be worth looking at the default practice around those decisions and transparency around the decisions. The default practice in 2020 is have a transparency report that gives aggregate numbers of the sorts I just repeated, but that otherwise the actual decisions themselves are not easy to make public. And there are all sorts of reasons why those decisions, if made public as they happened, would be problematic: invasion of privacy, invasion of other rights, and to the extent that it's meant to not expose people to content that could be harmful, you run into the Streisand effect of saying, by the way, here's the content you're not supposed to see in a conveniently transparent and searchable database. And that's why my co-authors and I have been thinking about ways to make it a commonplace, a kind of nobody ever went wrong buying IBM sort of default decision, not to just do it and have a few pages of transparency report, but to undertake those decisions and figure out how to bank those decisions, the evidence of them, the content behind it, in a manner that doesn't run into invasions of rights for having documented it and release it freely, but that doesn't just have it become part of a memory hole for which either in the near term or the long term, there's no way for humanity to evaluate these decisions that are being made, to be sure, about speech, not about typical market items like widgets or pig iron or something like that. So our paper intends to offer the beginnings of a framework by which companies could feel like it's a comfortable best practice rather than something edgy to do, share the nature and content of their decisions with the kind of granularity that these decisions may call for rather than summary statistic, but not just have to release it publicly. And that idea is, as Alex said, this practice of the gift shrink, the poison cabinet, that for many, many years in Germany, as a flagship jurisdiction in which this would take place, libraries would house materials that were formally banned and secure them both against ubiquitous access and preserve them so that those who were accredited in one way or another could have a chance to study them, to understand them, to report back to everybody else about them. And that's what our paper starts to explore. What might something like a gift shrink look like for these massive decisions newly being made at scale? And what role might institutions outside of the private companies making these decisions, what role might those institutions, canonically the great libraries of the world, play in helping to warehouse that information, to properly administer access to it, and to present that for the ages. So we're hoping to advance discussion around it by pressure testing the kind of model, how it would work, and very pleased on behalf of myself and my colleagues, Elaine and John, who both have affiliations with Berkman Klein Center. And for Elaine, somebody working on Facebook's privacy and data policy team, we figured we didn't just want to suggest it as a kind of theoretical idea, but really try to see what it would look like if it were tried in practice. And that is one of the many things Elaine helpfully contributed to this proposal. So that's our idea.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Team Gift Shrink. A fascinating idea that brings to us, as is always appreciated, an exotic German word that of course existed, but we didn't know about. Okay, the final...
If it fails, people can have Schadenfreude.
Exactly. Well, I'm happy I didn't butcher the pronunciation because I wasn't sure. I went out on a limb. Is the plural Giftschranke? Is that what I understand from your paper?
It is, as a matter of fact, and how to pronounce it I will not dare to do because I believe this conversation is going to be preserved for the ages, and I won't put myself on the record mispronouncing the German language.
Well, hopefully I got it right. So our final author, before we go to our commenter, is Matthias Vermeulen, who is the Public Policy Director at AWO, which is a new data rights agency that provides legal consultancy and public policy services. And he is an affiliated researcher at the Center for Law, Science, Technology, and Society at the Free University of Brussels. Matthias, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex, for that introduction. And thanks to the Knight Institute to invite me as well, as I believe actually the only European on this conference. So it's a great honor for me to be here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my paper in a way of explain a little bit of my background first. Until 2019, I was working in the European Parliament, and in that position, I always was trying to assess policy interventions and proposals on the basis of available scientific evidence and data. Now, it turned out that wasn't really easy to do in a whole range of different digital policy files I was working on at the time, in particular on legislative files that touched upon the role of dominant platforms and the regulation of online illegal content, like terrorist content or hate speech in the European Union. And this concern became even more pressing when legislators' attention started to focus on disinformation, which since the Russian invasion of the Crimea in 2014 had become an increasingly important topic. Now, in that period, I really saw a lot of misguided policy proposals popping up. Political parties tried to come up with definitions of what quote unquote fake news could be and how it could be outlawed. And proposals were being contemplated to hold platforms even liable for the spreading of disinformation, which would be two terrible ideas from a freedom of speech perspective, which fortunately weren't implemented. Now, many of these ill-guided proposals were based on anecdotes about the role of platforms in facilitating the spreading and dissemination of disinformation. But we had no data whatsoever that could actually answer three big questions. One, to what extent are state and non-state actors actually trying to manipulate elections or democratic debates online? The second question is like, what is the exact role of the core infrastructure of some of these platforms, such as ad targeting mechanisms or content recommendation algorithms, in amplifying and disseminating disinformation? And finally, to what extent are any of the voluntary measures that platforms were implementing to counter disinformation actually effective, let alone necessary and proportionate from a fundamental rights perspective? But despite some initiatives, like for instance, Social Science One, which was initiated by Facebook, it really became clear that there was an enormous reluctance on behalf of the platforms to make such data available to both independent researchers and regulators. And this wasn't only a problem in the context of the disinformation debate, but in a whole set of policy discussions in which European governments wanted to address a number of perceived new online harms and threats. And time again, they struggled with coming up with good policy responses. And at least partly this was because there was no solid evidence to base their potential policy intervention on. So there was this massive information asymmetry between platforms on the one hand and relevant third parties such as regulators, researchers, and journalists on the other. But like I said, like platforms weren't really very keen to provide this data voluntarily because they lacked incentives to do so, because it could provide conclusive evidence about how their services might have actively contributed to the dissemination of this information. But they also argued that existing laws, in particular the EU's infamous General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, prevented them actually from handing over such data. And so in this article, I wanted to take a little bit a closer look at the extent to which that last point is actually true. And I wanted to disentangle this argument a bit more in detail to see where exactly the GDPR potentially could create confusion or legal uncertainty. And I wanted to have this sort of more detailed nitty-gritty analysis because in European discussions that I was attending, any mentioning of how a specific activity could violate the GDPR is a guaranteed conversation stopper, as no politician or no regulator would want to be perceived as encouraging something that would go against the GDPR. So I went systematically through the GDPR, looking first at what the legal basis would be for the sharing of personal data. And I concluded that there are currently two legal bases that would allow such sharing with independent researchers. The first one is consent, but this is cumbersome for many disinformation researchers for a number of reasons that I can go into a little bit more in detail later if anyone is interested. And the second one is legitimate interest, which would be quite tricky because if platforms would rely on that specific provision in the GDPR, they would have to take a whole range of measures that could potentially jeopardize the independence of the researchers and the legitimacy of any resulting study, since a platform would need to be closely scrutinizing the aims, the methods, and the use of data by the researcher. Now, the GDPR is quite a complex piece of legislation, and I will spare you most of the details here. But it's important to know that essentially there is a window of opportunity right now in the European Union to create more legal clarity about this difficult topic and to overcome some of the confusion which surrounds it. Now, the EU is currently in the process of adopting a new law called the Digital Services Act, or the EU likes acronyms, the DSA, which will be proposed before the end of the year, in which the legal obligation can be included that would force platforms to hand over data to independent researchers. And the GDPR allows now platforms to share personal data with those researchers if there's a substantial public interest in doing so. But to rely on this legal ground in the GDPR, that substantial public interest needs to be spelled out in a separate legal instrument. And the DSA could be that instrument in the future. However, such a separate legal basis would still leave a number of questions unanswered regarding the modalities and safeguards researchers would need to adhere to in order to safeguard the rights of data subjects, which is the people whose data are actually being analyzed. And I argue in my article that we can solve some of these concerns by adopting a code of conduct on access to platform data, which the GDPR allows for in Article 40, which could overcome some of these problems. And ultimately, and this is my last point, I think such a binding obligation in EU law is crucial to hold platforms properly to account for the role they might play in facilitating the dissemination and recommendation of disinformation and potentially other types of contents. Thank you.
Matthias, thank you so much, especially for taking up the difficult task of explaining the GDPR and its nuances to an audience that has, for I think, quite a long time been reluctant to learn it. Our final speaker, who is our commenter, is Evelyn Dueck. Welcome, Evelyn. Evelyn is a lecturer on law and an SJD candidate at Harvard Law School, and she is also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center. Evelyn.
Fantastic, thank you. It is such a privilege to get to comment on such three wonderful and important papers. These proposals are all extremely exciting to me, but also terrifying. And that's because in my work, I've gotten into the habit of talking about the importance of transparency to legitimacy and making sure that we ground our responses to our current information dystopia and empirical research. And then I inevitably get to a point where I say, and oh, damn, we don't have that research yet. So I guess I can't tell you exactly what the answer to our problem is. Oh well, not my problem. And your proposals all suggest tangible, practical paths forward that would force us all to confront that actual last question. Okay, so what should we do? And that's both exciting and terrifying. So Hannah, your paper so compellingly illustrates the failures of FOIA and our current transparency deficits. Your paper was the most out of my personal wheelhouse, but it actually really highlighted for me that one of the common themes here is that we, as much as we often focus on this being a technology issue, it's also in a very real sense just a privatization issue, and how much sometimes defining something as a technology issue or allowing fancy technological terms to take center stage can be a red herring. And it moves the ball and defines the conversation on the terms most favorable to those who need to be reined in, which is our technology overlords. So this is a theme I'll pick up on again in the context of disinformation in a minute. I've sensed that you seem to resist this framing as merely one of privatization and trade secrets problems on steroids, facilitated by technology and exacerbated by under-resourced regulators. But I did wonder whether really your paper was kind of like a call for us not to be distracted by the tech talk. And in that light, Team Gift Shrunk, how could anyone not love the idea of a poison cabinet? I love especially the two case studies you give in your paper. I've been saying for a while, we need a world infodemic commission because the pandemic forced a natural experiment in platform content moderation changes. But sadly, no such commission looks likely, but your paper provides a model. To be a little provocative or annoying, I do wonder whether the gift shrunk approach is ultimately too big of a compromise to platforms' concerns and too much of a highlighting of the short-term risks that you identify, and whether we can add the long-term focus and curation and archival approaches to the projects that we already have instead of creating a new project for that purpose alone, so that we don't also neglect the really, really important short-term focus in a world of urgent problems and rapidly transforming regulatory and technical landscapes. Looking at the measures that we already have a 2016 gift shrunk-esque disclosure to researchers supporting the Senate Intelligence Committee inquiry into Russian interference. We have Twitter's archive of state-sponsored disinformation operations and similar ad hoc disclosures of individual campaigns by Facebook and others to independent researchers. We have a call for something similar in the context of war crimes evidence with platforms' takedown of violent content and the possibility of something similar being set up for the International Court of Justice case about Myanmar. We're looking at getting audits to Facebook's community standards, which Jay-Z, you mentioned earlier. Those audits might be coming in the coming year. And so I wonder whether at heart, what you're calling for is not actually a gift shrunk, but maybe a gift shrunk ethos, and reminding us of the importance of also thinking big picture and long term about these issues rather than like the specific project. And I'll come back to that in a minute as well. But Matthias, you and I were talking yesterday, and I was saying how I basically agree with your paper, and I'm not really a GDPR expert, and so I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about. And you said, let's talk about YouTube. And I thought that's a great idea. So we're going to talk about YouTube, because really, to me, your paper is about solving what I've come to think of as the YouTube problem. All right, so what's the YouTube problem? It is not that there are too many cat videos, although that is a problem. The YouTube problem is that we have spent the entire week talking about Twitter and Facebook's actions with respect to the New York Post story, or what, not we, probably just me. That's my job. And YouTube hasn't made a peep about the videos on its site making the same claims. And that has been YouTube's entire MO for the past 4 years. Keep quiet, don't make a lot of disclosures, and let the other platforms take their heat, and it works. We talk about disinformation on Facebook and Twitter far more because they disclose far more. And do we think YouTube discloses less because it doesn't have a lot of disinformation? Friends, we do not think that is why. So by proposing a path for actual legal obligations, we remove what Team Giftschrank has called the first mover disadvantage in disclosures. But I wonder whether we actually do solve the YouTube problem with your proposal, or do we just move it to a different point in the chain? Because your paper also demonstrates that it's not really just a YouTube problem, it's all platforms like to obfuscate to a degree. And your proposal centers around disclosures of disinformation. It's the topic du jour. But as you yourself noted, that's not an objective or clear term with a defined definition. And in my work, I've been especially critical of the term coordinated inauthentic behavior and the like, and how they use technical sounding names to obscure what are really deeply subjective judgments. And so do we really solve the YouTube problem, or do we just move it up the chain to the process of defining and identifying what constitutes disinformation? And is there any way around that that doesn't require extreme government involvement in monitoring the content on platforms? I want to finish on a final note of caution and a joke, because I'm incorrigible. So in an off-the-record conversation with an ex-tech executive recently, I was struck by a comment he made that he said, "I think the world will soon be drowning in transparency from these companies." We have all internalized the literature that has been referred to many times in these papers and across the course of these 2 days, that transparency is not an end in and of itself. And of course, we already have a lot of transparency theater. We have these transparency reports and community standards reports that in reality tell us very little. And Hannah, in your paper, you talk about often the futility of impact assessments. There's a joke about a kid who finds a genie lamp and rubs it, and the genie says, "What is your first wish?" And the kid says, I wish to be rich." And the genie says, "It is done. What is your second wish, Rich?" And I wonder whether we are currently the kids rubbing on the lamp going, we need transparency, and that we may soon be very, very rich, but that it is also important in this moment to be very specific in our demands and goals so that we are also wealthy with insight at the end of it, rather than simply moving the YouTube problem around to a different point in the chain. I don't have, again, I get to that point where I go, I don't have any answers to that, just more questions. But thank you so much for these wonderful papers. And I hope that they really advance the project here.
Evelyn, thank you so much for that tour de force summation of these papers and effort to link them to each other. I want to kind of pick up with maybe the first question where you left off, and this will be a question for everyone. So whoever wants to jump in first, feel free to. But a theme of this entire conference, and certainly a theme of a good chunk of Hannah's paper, was the question of what ends are we hoping that transparency in this context will serve? How do we measure success, in other words, of a program of algorithmic transparency. And Hannah situates this question in the context of a separate debate or related debate about the term that we use to describe the goal here. Is it algorithmic transparency or is it algorithmic accountability? Are we embedding our value in the choice of that term? And so I want to start there because it may inform this question that you, I think, are alluding to, Evelyn, of how do we we have a bunch of proposals now on the table. We have these three and some other, others that have been made. And these three are especially provocative, but how do we prioritize between them on the assumption that we have limited political capital to achieve any of these, if we can achieve any of them? How do we prioritize among them? And maybe we can start to answer that question by asking, what are we trying to achieve? How do we measure success when it comes to algorithmic transparency? So let me start there. And I don't know who wants to jump in, but especially if Elaine or John want to jump in, since you haven't had a chance to talk yet, but just jump in as you wish.
Sure, I'll jump in. So one objective of transparency that we talked about a lot was sort of as an accountability reinforcing function. This idea that, as the platforms are rolling out more and more sort of user engagement and accountability reinforcing structures, a way to build credibility for those things and to sort of cement them as legitimate and well-founded in the public mind is necessarily going to involve leaning on empirical data. So one value of a GIFSHRONK or GIFSHRONK ethos informed model might be to make more data of that kind, of a more granular sort, available to the kinds of researchers and other kind of agents of accountability who might be in a position to evaluate that empirical evidence and then reflect it back to the broader community of people who are evaluating the company's content moderation procedures, as well as the accountability structures that they've built around those accountability procedures. So sort of attaching hard data to those kinds of debates and considerations is something that we see as indispensable for sort of moving forward in terms of the accountability of platforms with regards to content moderation in particular.
Hannah, I wonder how that resonates with you. You in your paper try to push us toward a different set of values underlying the project of algorithmic of transparency, I think, including democratic participation. So a focus less on legitimating these systems, but rather ensuring that they serve democratic ends or ends of participatory governance. So I wonder how, if you have a reaction to John's thought there or to the general question.
Yeah, I think that, I actually really relate to John's description of transparency as performing an accountability reinforcing function. And I think that that is a really critical aspect to what transparency in a sort of government context is doing. And we might initially think that, perhaps the role of transparency is really different when we're talking about relationships between governments and vendors than when we're talking about content moderation and what platforms are doing. I don't think that they're necessarily as far apart as we might think. I think the sort of impetus for my paper is that we've been paying, I think, not enough, but substantial attention to the ways that expert bodies and regulators should respond to the emergence of AI in government, and thinking about new modes of regulation to respond to these transformations in governance. And I think what we haven't adequately sort of accounted for is what the role of the public is in performing oversight and ultimately legitimating these actions. And the thing about the government context that perhaps makes that a little bit different is that I think what's critical here, if we want to legitimate these systems, and I'm not sure that I do personally want to legitimate them, but I think what's critical to do that is sort of a broader form of public participation. I think, however, that that's more critical in the private context too than we necessarily always assume. So in other words, to just TLDR it. I think that both sort of expert oversight, academic research, like scholarly research, independent accounting for what these systems are doing, and public input and democratic input are critical. And I see sort of these proposals as proceeding along parallel tracks in that respect.
Okay, can I ask you a follow-up on that, Hannah? But then if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. What does public participation look like to you? There's a part of your paper where you propose that we change government, federal procurement policy or state procurement policy so that state actors don't contract with private vendors of artificial intelligence or machine learning systems unless the companies agree to disclose, and you use the term critical information about their systems. And I'm hoping you can say a little bit more about that, because I take the comments of, for example, Julia's keynote a few minutes ago, Julia Angwin's keynote, or of Matthias's paper to be that there's more to understanding these systems, than their outputs, maybe even more to understanding them than their inputs. Matthias calls it the core infrastructure, understanding how the core infrastructure influences the decisions made. Others have called this the kind of the black box, the difficulty of studying, understanding machine learning systems. So what sort of information would you want the public to have, as opposed to a kind of small technocratic elite, which you seem to be reluctant to kind of hand over all means of transparency to, which I sympathize with. But what does the public need?
I mean, I think first I would resist the impulse to say, well, you, the public, you get this one set of information, and you, the technocratic elite, you get a different set, because we've made a decision that it's most effective for whatever the goals are of this arrangement, that there are different sort of kinds of information being dispensed. I think that raises problems from a sort of watchdog accountability perspective. We don't know who the watchdogs are going to be in this space. And so I think I'm a little bit ambivalent about saying there should be different kinds of information made available. But I take the point that the general public as a rule is going to have to effectuate information in different ways than experts will. And there, I think, I'm still not sure exactly how that'll play out. So I think about, stories like the machine bias stories about how AI is functioning in racist ways, and the ways that members of the public, members of activists, members of social movements took that information and then leveraged it for political change in a lot of settings. And so I guess I'm thinking about, I want to be mindful of the fact that a lot of this information might be used in ways that we can't necessarily predict, and might be leveraged for political change in ways that we can't predict. And so I'm not sure that carving out these sort of fine-tuned distinctions is always going to make sense.
Team Gifshawn, can we turn to you on this question? And one of the premises of your paper, I think, is that we have to draw these distinctions. Is that at least for studying some of these problems, the data is sufficiently sensitive and private, and you have a variety of concerns that you list with making this data public. One of them is just that you'll cause the same harms that cause the platforms to take the data down, the information down in the first place, which might be, it could be noxious speech, hateful speech that you don't want to, the platforms are trying to suppress, not continue to propagate. So what do but your proposal goes all in on this idea that we have, a specialized access. And maybe I'll note, Jonathan, that this kind of continues a trend in your scholarship of sending the librarians in as the solution to many of the problems of technology. So can you speak to that?
I would like to jump in and kind of highlight something that Hannah brought up, and I apologize. The sun has come out for the first time in the entire day. So one of the key questions I see on privacy and data policy a lot is who is a researcher. So one of the ways that you can keep data secure is by having only people who have, this interest and this public interest in studying it and the expertise to keep it safe. But in thinking about the points that Hannah has brought up, who qualifies? We see in the scientific community, citizen science has done really great things. And we've seen, and I think about things on an international scale, that the last thing I would want to do is bias a data set access points based on Western ideals of in the US and EU, who is a traditional academic and who is not. And I think that could exclude scholars in other parts of the world. However, understanding where that line is, because then it's a very different, having a very public archive, which we discuss in the paper, is is a very different privacy set of questions. And that's one of the reasons we had the proposals that we did, is it's restricted, it's more controlled, that would allow some sort of area for trade-off. But there's not a lot of solid questions, I think, in the scholarship. And this comes up in many different data sharing initiatives. And it's highly relevant, I think, to other points in the papers on, how to responsibly share data so that it doesn't run afoul of laws. And I would love to see more scholarship about that, because we point to the problem in the paper, but we certainly don't have an answer to that yet.
Matthias or Evelyn, do you want to jump in on this question of, how do we measure just this question of first principles? And, the topic of this panel is engineering access to data, but presumably for some purpose. And we've danced around this question the entire conference of, what the value is we're trying to serve. And here, we're at the point where the rubber meets the road. We have, proposals on the table. How do we, prioritize as between them? What values are we, or what's the end result we're hoping to accomplish through the, access to data that we have?
I mean, I think it's also very related to like the previous set of questions as well, whether you need to sort of have like one universal standard that provides access to data for a whole range of different categories of people, of researchers, of a potential regulator, for instance, and link that also to the fact that, at least in my view, like transparency and access to data is not a goal in itself, but it's a mere means to achieve a higher end goal, which is for instance, in the examples that I raise in my paper, linked to holding the platforms accountable for the potential role they may play in facilitating or amplifying specific forms of harmful content, actually. And that is also sort of the policy idea that's on the table in the European Union. And I think, for instance, if you're a potential platform regulator and you want to assess how platforms adhere to specific new due diligence obligations that will be imposed on them, then sure, you want to have access, and you need to have access to the most granular level of data that is available, including trade, like information that is potentially protected by trade secrets. And that is, we have precedents for that in European competition law as well, where investigators can go into secure data rooms where a company does provide access to that regulator of highly sensitive data. And I think such a regime and the aim of the disclosure of that data is quite different from for instance, if you're a public interest researcher and you want to more deeply scrutinize a societal phenomenon, you also have like a very legitimate ask to provide some access, and you can discuss some of the modalities and vetting standards and sort of criteria that you need to adhere to in line to what Elaine was saying. But then you have also this sort of third layer, this sort of transparency for the general public, which I think, for instance, a good example is the mandatory ad libraries that some of these platforms have been implementing, in which you as an ordinary citizen can really go and look like, well, now I have more data that tells me why I have been shown a particular piece of information, but that's sort of a particular advertisement. But that sort of level of transparency is in no way sufficient if you want to achieve one of those other goals, like if you are a regulator or if you are, for instance, a specific researcher who wants to have bulk access to that data, or who wants to have access to more like privacy sensitive information, such as targeting parameters or any sort of information that deserves a little bit more protection.
Yeah, I mean, I just really quickly say that I completely agree with that. It's, you know, this problem that we always run into in this space. It's like, it's tempting to like talk about content moderation or like AI and like it's one thing. And we are now in a place where really it's like, it's everything. And we need to talk about like the specific issues within that in a very specific context. I was struck by all of the examples in Hannah's paper, how they raise like a bunch of different issues. And similarly in the content moderation space, as Matthias was just outlining, you know, they all raise different issues, like in the hate speech or the war crimes or the you know, the genocide evidence like context. That is the kind of content that, you know, you could redo the harm if it was out in public. Then we have, like as Matthias was just saying, the ad archives, or, you know, the stuff that I'm talking about when I talk about coordinated inauthentic behavior and stuff. Most of that stuff's like pretty innocuous and like legitimate political speech. What makes that problematic is like the inauthenticity or the fact that it was a fake account. It's not actually particularly egregious, and re-exposing people to that is not the issue. And so, you know, unfortunately, I think the project is really hard for us because the trade-offs in every context are going to be completely different. And the project of asking what is when the genie asks us what do we want, I think in each context it's going to be really different.
That's great. So I want to, you know, ask a somewhat related question, I think, which is, you know, one thing that struck me about the three papers, and one distinction among them, is that Matthias and Team Giftschrank focus pretty exclusively, I think, on how to enable access to data by researchers. And Hannah, you gesture at one point to the importance of public participation and public disclosure as fostering a market in technical expertise by, for example, journalists in analyzing this data. And you point very specifically to the Markup and ProPublica and similar organizations. And so, you know, the question I suppose is, where do journalists fit into the need for access to data? You know, we just had a keynote by Julia Angwin, whose work has moved the needle in this area in a way that the work of few others has. And you know, she has been ingenious in being able to collect data sets from which she can derive statistically significant insights. But even when she can't get data sets that are clean enough to do that, she identifies anecdotes that move people. And she can't tell you always that the anecdote's representative. She doesn't have always the access to data that allows her to make those sorts of claims that you need to be able to make if you wanted to publish a paper that makes a statistically significant claim that a journal will publish. But her pieces and the pieces of her colleagues move the needle. They move public policy. They convince people in ways that researcher access alone may not. And so I guess mainly a question for Matthias and for Team Giftschrank, you know, where do journalists fit into the need for access to data?
Sure. So, yeah, we think that this is a really important point. And we also think that a key part of building out any sort of, you know, new set of data sharing protocols or practices of the scope that we're suggesting would necessarily be sort of the extension and reevaluation of the traditional means by which people are, you know, authorized for data access. And that's actually one place where we think that libraries and the archival profession more broadly have really played an important role in the past and continue to play an important role in the future. So yeah, we totally see the importance of moving beyond, I guess, like to sort of like traditional university-led research approach that's often employed in, you know, privileged data access instances like this. And we think that there's a lot of sort of latent expertise in the librarian space in particular for sort of setting those arrangements up and handling the risk management that sort of fundamentally comes with them.
Matthias, you want to jump in? Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, it's a really hard question, and I really haven't touched upon it in my paper. Because I think like in the legal situation in the EU is that it is pretty straightforward to a certain extent to provide that sort of access to platform data for both independent researchers and for potential regulators, especially from a GDPR perspective. But for journalists, it's like slightly more complicated because you enter lots of questions of who can actually qualify as a quote unquote proper journalist, sort of similar to some of the question that Elaine was raising, and who can qualify as a sort of legitimate academic or an independent researcher as well, of course. And at the same time, I really do think that we need to come up with some sort of special access regime for journalists as well, for exactly the reasons that you have been saying as well, Alex. And I remember reading a very recent paper by Kate Starbert recently, who basically interviewed lots of different journalists on the misinformation and disinformation beat, and they were actually actively complaining that in their view, academics were already getting access to way more data than they ever got, actually. And I think that sort of relates to the potential impact that journalistic stories can have in terms of PR crisis or problems for some of these problems as well. So yes, like I can be blamed like I forgot about the journalist, but that's something for a next paper. Or maybe Evelyn can sort of think about a solution for this particular problem.
Evelyn will handle all the overflow questions.
I wanted to add something real quick, which is part of the reason I think all of us are united in wanting to push for a kind of quantum increase in the amount of transparency here is we know how powerful the stuff is, how important it is to know about it. And surely there will be instances that are highly varied, as Evelyn points out, depending on the circumstance, in which that data being made available in bulk, basically forever, the part of its power is it could be really harmful in certain ways. And there are now coming to be practices for dealing with that, for bulk data that may have a use in bulk, but we don't want to focus on it individually because of the harms that could arise for that. We have differential privacy, one of the most amazing examples of something going from an academic lab. Somebody like Cynthia Dwork proposes it just in theory, and then a few years later, you have Apple implementing it, or Facebook trying to work it through as part of the many gears spinning within the SSRC project. And that's an example then of trying to neutralize any toxicity of the data on the front end so that it can then be released far and wide on the other end. I think there's going to be limits to that approach, especially if you want to be able to look at individual circumstances. And it just seems like if you're not in a position to do that, either because it renders the data too useless or it's too hard to do or too costly, and if you're not a big company, it may indeed be, then something like a gift shrink approach can trade off not having to defang it on that end, so long as you have decent understandings that it can be respected on the other end and only used under a standard for salutary purposes. And for that, whether or not it's by identity, are you a researcher? Are you a journalist? What is a journalist? That kind of thing. It might not just be by identity, but by what you are prepared to agree to, that as a normal citizen on the street, you wouldn't have to agree to. And are there ways to back up your promise? Can you post a bond? Is there somebody ready to post a bond on your behalf? And I mean, this gets squarely back to what Hannah was raising, which is, are there forms of disclosure that aren't defanged on the provisional end that then can be limited on the access end in a way that still serves the public interest? And I think I ask that not as a question with an obvious answer, but it does say, yeah, maybe there's enough. Like, I'm happy if Ralph Nader can look at safety data on the Corvair, and maybe these days Ralph should be friends with some data scientists. It shouldn't just be like Ralph looking at it. But there are people who are proxies for the public interest, and if there are enough of them and if they're varied enough, that might be sufficient to the cause, while also making it so that there can be some sense of forestalling and having accountability for misuses of that powerful data that you would not have if you just put it in pastebin.
Hannah, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I agree completely that there are deep parallels to this question of who is a researcher and who is a journalist. But I think that this conversation is sort of leading us into an ever like replicating question of, well, if this person, this kind of entity gets access, shouldn't this one also? And I think when it comes to journalism, we might be missing the forest for the trees, because the real question to my mind is, what is the role of the press in fostering democratic accountability and, making information, translating information for the public, making meaningful information accessible, and promoting sort of better decision making. And so in that respect, I think we might be, wrong to just say, well, journalists are just like any other interest group that might want access to this stuff. And so we just have to be careful about like which ones we give it to. I think we need to think a little bit more systemically about what the role of journalism in this space really is, as Julia was sort of talking about. And the traditional way, I think, of making sure that journalists would do the right thing with the information they get is, through professional ethics and through the law, right? Through ex post sanctions for wrongful publication. And so I wonder whether we might just be thinking about this at the wrong level, to the extent we're trying to just, silo out journalism as just another sort of set of actors who are craving access to this information.
Hey, Alex, can I ask Hannah a question?
Please.
I'm thinking inevitably about the old-time WikiLeaks before it was a Russian cutout, or maybe it was, we just didn't know it yet. And they released a bunch of stuff to The Guardian and the New York Times, I believe it was, that then had a whole team of journalists that went through it and redacted and yada, yada, and then came out with reporting based on the documents. And I'm curious, honestly, if you think that The Guardian and the Times, in possession of the unredacted documents, owed it to the public to just release it all as an appendix anyway, so that it could have fulsome public further look at. And it's also, I think, WikiLeaks just pulled a YOLO and at some point just released it all anyway, after having done this careful process with The Guardian and the Times. And just to tip my hand, I think there was something valuable in having that intermediate filtration, and that may not have been so good if they had just also said, and we just find it incumbent upon ourselves to release everything without redaction, just because why should we have any benefit that the public does not?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think filtration is important. I think editing is important. I think the question is, who does it, right? So should it be the journalists at the Times and the Guardian and the Washington Post who do the curation and filtration, or the analogy here, in other words, should those journalists be given access to the gift shrunk and then they decide what to do with the information? Or should they be given some other pre-curated set of information that that they then get to publish as they see fit? And I think I prefer the former.
I think we do too. I think we're thinking that the libraries and archives would run the gift shrink rather than the originators of the material.
Matthias, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to try to sort of link Evelyn's YouTube question to sort of the stories that we've been discussing on citizen science and the role of journalists, and Ralph Nader, who was being mentioned by Jonathan Zitrain. I was very by coincidence, actually, I was watching a documentary about Ralph Nader, which was called like An Unreasonable Man. And like that sort of tagline came from the car industry, like just immediately after he published his infamous book from, I think, 1955, in which he was basically for the first time sort of highlighting the harms that could be caused by the automobiles and the lack of safety measures that they were implementing. And of course, he got like lots of criticism from the car industry. many of core executives calling him completely unreasonable because he didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know all the technical modalities and safety measures that were being implemented. And I had to think of Ralph Nader when I'm looking at the response of some of the platforms, including YouTube, for instance, to some of these sort of citizen science-led experiments that try to overcome the lack of access to data that journalists, but also academics and regulators have. So for instance, I'm talking about the initiative of ProPublica, where Jeremy Merrill was basically trying to create an ad archive by scraping the data sort of against in this gray zone of what's illegal and not illegal, what goes against the terms of services of Facebook or not. Or initiatives like a German NGO called Algorithm Watch in Germany, who try to experiment in seeing like what kind of recommendations Instagram would be providing to its users, but also something that the Mozilla Foundation on a much bigger scale recently was trying to do, and basically crowdsourcing user data about specific videos were being recommended to them actually. And like every single time out of these sort of citizen science or new experiments to get more insight into how content is being promoted to us or recommended to us, all the platforms, they would always say like, well, sounds very interesting, and we encouraged every sort of initiative that would shed more light on some of our practices, and we value their efforts and so on, but their methodology is completely wrong. They don't know what they're talking about, but we're not going to say to you like why that methodology is exactly wrong actually. And so for me, that is indeed like one of the core problems actually. Like if we that links also a bit to the fact I'm describing in my paper, that there is absolutely no independent mechanism to verify some of the statements that some of the platforms have been making on the efficiency and the effectiveness of some of the measures that they have been implementing. It's sort of like one of my favorite bands is called The Magic Numbers. And I always have to think of them when I hear again a claim of like, yes, we have been able to successfully delete 99% of all terrorist content of our platforms. Or right now we have been managing to expose or to our viewers in the US and the UK, they have been exposed 70% less to borderline content. And there's absolutely no way to verify these claims. And I think also that these are like, we shouldn't be depending on these sort of voluntary initiatives or citizen science initiatives or initiatives by NGOs or by foundations, for instance, but we should have like a much more solid, independent, robust mechanisms to provide more scrutiny of some of these claims actually.
So we're getting now to about the time when we're going to take some questions from the audience. We have a few in the queue, and one of them actually mirrors a question more articulately than I had in mind, but one that I wanted to ask of Team Giftstrong. So I'm going to read this question, and for those who can see it, which I think is just the panelists, this is Dan's question, Dan Book, who was on an earlier panel. And Dan asks, he says, Julie Cohen's paper yesterday reminds us that the choice of a solution ends up shaping how we see problems. Does something like a Giftstrong frame the key problem as bad content and therefore turn attention away from the way that content is being spread, shared, or managed by the platforms? Another way to say it is it more important to find out what the platforms are removing entirely than to find out what the platforms are systemically depressing or amplifying? And it may be that your answer to this is along the lines of what Evelyn gave us earlier, which is there are many different questions and we need a different mechanism to answer each one. But in a world of limited, as I mentioned earlier, political capital to accomplish any of these objectives, what do you make of Dan's question? Are we overly focused on the sensational act of removing content from the platforms and not focused enough on the less sensational but perhaps more potent act of amplifying or suppressing the content that remains?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question and something we thought about a lot. And in particular, I guess the way we were thinking about it was as sort of the risk of using the takedown as the principal unit of analysis in content moderation, because in a lot of cases that just like doesn't apply. So we think that a gift-strong model could conceivably expand to cover all sorts of content that's actioned. And that's the phrasing that we try to deploy throughout the paper, to talk not just about stuff that's taken down, but stuff that is demoted or otherwise conditioned or affected in terms of its circulation and visibility by platforms' content moderation techniques. So we think that that should absolutely be part of at least the ideal data set. Whether takedowns are the right first step, I think is another question. And one which I think has sort of tended to be the default in a lot of conversations. But yeah, that's something that we think is still very much up for sort of definition and resolution one way or the other.
What would that look like? Yeah, please, Evelyn, go for
it. Super quickly, and just say, I think, you're right. My answer would generally be, we have so many problems at the moment, and we're going to need lots of different answers, and we have to walk and chew gum to solve all of them. But I think inherent in the question is a point that I think is like a fundamental truth, which is that we do focus way too much on the take down, leave up questions in content moderation, because they are the most obvious, they are the ones right in front of us, and they feel like the easiest lever to pull, and that fundamentally often we are asking that to solve much bigger, much more difficult problems that can't be solved by content moderation. And I think this actually relates back to the conversation we were having before about who is a journalist and journalism ethics and things. We might all be primed by having just heard from Julia as a wonderful example of like the paradigm of journalism and journalist ethics. But that's, like I am this week thinking about what we might have seen a fundamental breakdown, like an institutional breakdown in terms of journalism ethics with the New York Post story. I'm sorry, just defamation. And I think, many people were looking to content moderation to solve that problem. And I'm not sure that that's a content moderation problem. I think that that's a much bigger and harder question than could be answered by platforms directly. So I just wanted to acknowledge the deep truth in that question, which is that sometimes we get distracted by the shiny and easy questions in front of us, and that can distract us from the deeper issues.
I think the distinction between stuff that's either fully taken down or not, and on the one hand, and stuff that has a clamp or not applied to it, a coefficient of friction, is a really interesting distinction. Totally agree with Evelyn on the need to be able to have both. And it also highlights the question about, well, what should be in a general repository that can be looked at later, and what should people be made aware of in context as they're using the service itself. And just speaking only for myself and showing, I'm going to just try sharing my screen and see if this works. I'm showing here what to me should be a famous, but maybe isn't, graph authored by Mark Zuckerberg, that in this case is descriptive. It's just showing that there's some axis here, a y-axis of engagement. And as you move to the right with this kind of neatly textured line, people tend to engage more with stuff that comes close to a policy line, he says. And at some point, the perfect mechanism kicks in as soon as it hits the policy line, derivatively thin, at which point it is banned and it drops to zero. There's no engagement for something that has been deep sixed. And he asks, I think not unreasonably as a first element, why shouldn't it be more like this? Now, I don't know if it should be kind of reverse exponential rather than asymptotic or something. But as things get close to whatever the line is, shouldn't there be a coefficient of friction on it applied by the system so that edgy stuff gets shared less? And one response would be, well, stuff that comes close to the line but isn't, Lenny Bruce, maybe has a lot of value. And the fact that it didn't cross the line means it shouldn't be clamped. On the other hand, in the toolkit of moderating stuff, maybe it's less of an imposition to ban something than just to disfavor it, or really to choose to favor the stuff behind it, which then in a zero-sum world of attention would naturally disfavor the rest. And I think that's a really interesting question. My question back would be, why shouldn't people know the coefficient of friction? Like, I'm about to post this, here is the friction it's about to experience. And I think the state-of-the-art answer so far is there's so many variables that would go into that recipe, we couldn't possibly solve for it and offer it to the person in the moment, which I'm not sure I understand, because you have to solve for it and offer it at the point it's getting engaged with or shared around into people's feeds. But that's the kind of thing that I guess depends on whether you worry about people using this to game the system. Oh, I'll just keep proposing to post something and tweak it in immaterial ways that eventually get the system to offer up the least amount of clamp. All right, that's bad, because imperfect clamps will then be worked around. Or if you don't threaten to murder someone in this proposed post, the reward is it will not be clamped, at which point we do want people to work towards removing murderous admonitions from their posts. But all of that stuff might be worthwhile to share both to people as it's happening and be part of some form of gift shrink, so that later we can go back and look at these very complex dynamics that without the data, the hard data, we're just not going to be in a position to understand what we're doing.
Can I push you to go a little deeper on this, Jonathan? So I take that explanation when you're talking about a kind of negative coefficient, if you will, right? A coefficient of friction, as you say. Part of what some people are concerned about, and this is Matthias's experience, I think, and his focus on the spread of disinformation, is not necessarily the spread of information that is anywhere near a policy line, but just gets amplified, has a positive coefficient. Now, maybe Zuckerberg's graph is meant to suggest that the only things that ever get amplified by the system are things that are approaching a policy line after, beyond which they'll be suppressed. But that doesn't seem to be the experience of, some in looking at the platform. Disinformation isn't prohibited by the platform. It doesn't come close to any of Facebook's lines, I don't think, to spread general falsehoods that aren't about people, specific people, and aren't, about particular forbidden topics like the location of a voting booth or the like. But they're getting amplified nonetheless, and people maybe want to know why, why Facebook has decided to amplify this piece of content. And I wonder if you have a thought about that. If whether Dan's concern still holds for that kind of content, amplification of stuff that isn't approaching some policy line, but may have some cost to society.
Well, I mean, it's almost like once we get into the content moderation business, where do you stop? And I mean, what is an educator supposed to do in a 5th grade classroom, but in the limited time in the room, try not to say 2 + 2 is 5, or the moon landing was faked, or whatever? And if that's the world we're in, that level of curation might make sense. I mean, one of the things about social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and others is that they're so generic in their expectations of how people might use them. I might say they're generative in a good way. Who knows what they're going to use them for next? But to the extent that people turn up with a certain set of expectations where it might substitute for a 5th grade classroom, then the fact that there's no vetting of the sort that a teacher would do becomes a problem. I just wonder at what point trying to simply carve out areas that are no-go areas, like, as you point out, lies about voting precinct locations or dates or something, where it's a brighter line from the moon landing was faked, send, or 2 + 2 = 5, send. I mean, the most I could think of would be, all right, when do we reach into the toolkit and say, well, let there just be labeling? And in the case of engagements too, the platform might not know why it's amplifying something, or it's being amplified through proxies. Like, a bunch of people are clicking like on this and leaving comments. Well, that seems to be something that's generating controversy or generating engagement. That might be part of a formula rather than the exclusive formula that would amplify. And then it turns out, oh, fake moon landing turns out to be, a popular topic. So I would start to be nervous about asking the platforms without looking towards external citation and functions. Maybe this is another one of my send in the librarians idea. Is there anything they can't do to independently be like, Microsoft has decided that, Xbox is better than ColecoVision. And so posts about ColecoVision, well, it's a lot to ask of these intermediaries.
Well, I guess to be fair, the suggestion isn't that we need to understand that so that we can, so that they can disable that kind of speech. But if it turns out, for example, that machine learning algorithms tuned to promote engagement have the side effect of promoting specific kinds of disinformation, it may be good for us to know that. It may be good, and it may be good for the platforms to know that. And do we know that the platforms have studied that, have tried to understand what the collateral consequences are of the machine learning systems they've built? Because they may have very real consequences for public discourse that they may also care about.
Well, surely that's the case. I mean, I wouldn't even qualify it the way you've qualified it. Absolutely important to know that. Whether or not an approach of just trying to document every decision and the content and metadata around it starts to hold for that, or whether there's some other way to incorporate a theory of amplification that's being applied to favor some posts and not others, and then disclose the theory, maybe in that case, the latter is the way to go. So.
Unless anyone wants to jump in on that question, I was going to take another one from our Q&A queue. All right, so the next question comes from Judith Rauhofer from the University of Edinburgh, who asked another great question on an earlier panel. So thank you, Judith, for your great questions. And she asked a question that I think, I'll read it in a second, but it goes to a question that came up during yesterday's panels. And the critique that had come up during yesterday's panels is that in these conversations, there's often an inclination to focus on particular kinds of technology as being the problem, rather than recognizing that the context in which a technology is embedded, its full societal context, needs to be considered in deciding what the problem is and what the solutions might look like. And so in that vein, Judith asks, would it be heretic or naive to ask whether we could just ban or at least restrict the tracking of user behavior? Rather than cutting off one Hydra head after the other, we cut off the raw material that enables much of the amplification. And so, if you want to answer her direct question, great. But if not, maybe the broader question of, is our conversation today too narrowly focused on specific legal interventions rather than trying to address the system that has produced opaque public spheres or opaque public discourse? Let me just throw that out there, and anyone who wants to jump in, please do.
I can address Judith's question directly, and maybe it's also because I'm a fellow European, but I don't think there's anything heretic or improbable to that suggestion as well. In fact, I think Europe has now the tools to sort of rule out that kind of tracking as well. Like if we would only have like an enforcement decision of the data minimization and purpose limitation principles in the GDPR, then we have already then some of the current tracking practices will be tremendously in trouble as well, actually. I mean, in fact, we just have seen just today, a document coming out from the Belgian data protection regulator, which found massive problems with the IAB's current ad tech infrastructure as well. And I think there's especially the appetite among regulators in Europe is so great to ban this actually to this extent that we're even contemplating because GDPR enforcement is going so slow and is faced with so many problems, to actually deal with this problem in a competition law approach as well. And there's all these sort of thoughts and theories being envisaged in which excessive data sharing in a sort of competition context via third-party trackers could be actually labeled as an unfair commercial practice in the EU sort of toolbox as well. So I think those are definitely concrete options that are on the table, at least in Europe, for at this point in time.
Can I give another example of something that I see, like it's a parallel issue here, and it's the Chekhov's gun that I placed earlier about coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is that we spend a lot of time like focused on foreign campaigns and, these concerted efforts, and we think about it as that's the problem and we need to get rid of that thing. And I think that is kind of this obfuscation where we are forgetting the deeper question, which is that there is a fundamental, like built into the system is that like pretty much everything is inauthentic to certain degrees and coordinated to certain degrees, and that the system incentivizes that kind of behavior, and that the problem is not like foreign actors, said the Australian in America. I take this very personally, this issue, that, the problem is like we need to have better ideas about like what is appropriate activity online and what is appropriate behavior that doesn't focus on like this foreign threat framing, but interrogates that deeper societal issue. And I think that that's like a similar theme that's thrown up by this question.
I think that was also one of the conclusions, for instance, from René DiResta, right? One of the researchers who had access to all the platform data in the context of the US Senate Intelligence Committee, that it wasn't really external. The key problem isn't really like external actors or foreign actors abusing the system, but they're using it in exactly the way it was built and supposed to function to a certain extent as well. And that's also why I'm much more interested. I mean, maybe a bit controversial for someone like Evelyn, but like essentially I don't care about content moderation decisions. Like I really care about like knowing much more how some of these specific pieces of content are being amplified by various mechanisms. And those are actually instances and things where platforms should be able to do something about. Like we shouldn't hold them responsible for what sort of content like their users are uploading, but we should hold them accountable and responsible for some stuff that they do have agency over as well, such as like the design of some of these content recommendation or curation mechanisms actually.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to give everyone one final word, and feel free to make it whatever word you want it to be. But I'll give you a question that you can answer if you choose. This panel was meant to be the one about possible solutions, and we have 3 great papers proposing possible solutions. And I'd like each of you to answer the question of, how do we make any of these a reality? And you're each dealing with different actors, so it may be interesting to hear all of you weigh in. Team Giftschrank, you're focused on the platforms and maybe Facebook in the first instance. Hannah, you're focused on all state actors potentially who procure private software. And Matthias, you have the seemingly entirely flexible lever of European law, unconstrained by the First Amendment to deal with. So maybe you could each say a word about that and any other word you want to say. And Evelyn, maybe you can close us off with some final thoughts on the question if you like. Hannah, you want to start? Can I put you on the spot to start?
Sure. I was just thinking such an uncomfortable position for an academic to be asked, okay, you've got a practical proposal, now go make it happen. But in this space, I'm actually not as disheartened as I would have been maybe a year or 2 ago. And the reason is that I think we're seeing this start to happen. We're seeing moves, for example, to prevent cities from adopting new surveillance technologies without notifying the public or without notice and comment or without public input. And it makes me think that how we make this happen is by galvanizing civil society and social movements to advocate for it. And maybe that means it's not going to happen, at least not for a while, at the federal level. And maybe it means it will be a harder push in some states and some cities than others. But broadly speaking, I think that we are seeing a range of social movements, disability rights activists, criminal justice reform activists, elder sort of advocates even, advocating for real policy change in this space, and policy change in particular that creates a voice for the voiceless. So I'm not, I guess that's a little bit of a dodge to say we'll get it done when people call for it with sufficient force, but I think they are starting to do exactly that.
Happy for you to close on a note of optimism. Who wants to go next?
I'll jump in for my team. As my career suggests, I am a deep pragmatist in trying to move the needle in a very applied way. And one of the reasons why I am sitting here and was encouraged to sit here is to try and talk through these possible solutions, because they're hard and there isn't some sort of, magic bullet that we can rely on. And I think that in our paper, what we propose is, how to advance the conversation. Certainly more research is needed. But I also think that, a spectrum of different options and an array of different things is also needed. And I think that's something that came up for me a lot during this conversation, is whether we're talking about journalists or researchers or the general public, I would rather see solutions that are put forth and tried, that are done responsibly, but sort of start to address it, but may fall short on some of the other issues that we brought up, but are at least trying to advance this. I'd rather see them promoted rather than waiting for the perfect solution, which I don't believe exists, especially with all the complexities that we've talked about here today and in general at this event.
So naturally I'm a pessimist, but on this particular topic, I'm really an optimist actually, because you should always be cautious when some of Europe's leading politicians are calling a new initiative like a once in a generation opportunity to change something. But when it comes to, for instance, some of the proposals that are on the table in Europe right now in the context of this Digital Services Act, I do think that might be true actually. And this is actually a unique opportunity to create change, like to impose new responsibilities and obligations in a sort of tech-savvy, human rights-proof way on some of the dominant platforms. And I truly believe actually that access to data and a specific legal obligation for platforms to hand over such data is going to be part of at least that initial proposal actually. So you can quote me on this and then I'll be happy to come back next year actually.
We'll love to have you for the update. Like I said, that maybe that the most progress, if you see this progress on this issue, will be made overseas and not in the United States. Evelyn?
Yeah, I don't really know what my final word should be. I'm tempted to finish with one of the many other genie lamp jokes that I was looking up last night on the internet in preparation. Instead, I guess I'd say, I am also uncharacteristically sort of in a moment of optimism. I feel like we are at an inflection point. I feel like in some ways, everything feels so frustrating and everything moves so slowly. But in some ways, actually, this whole thing is moving incredibly fast. And there are lots of things happening. And there has been a remarkable transformation of everything, even in the last 2 years. I'm always mind blown by the fact that Facebook's community standards were only made public in 2018. And oh my goodness, what a 2 years it's been, right? So I think, if we were to have this panel again in a year's time, it would be very, very different. It's kind of always the way to finish an academic conference with more research is needed, but I feel like we might be in a moment where that research might be forthcoming. So.
Well, I'm happy we had some notes of optimism, and I want to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful conversation and for your great contributions. Evelyn, for your typically lucid comments. Thank you all, and I know the audience can't participate in this, but thank you all for it. And I'll turn it over to Katie, who will close out the symposium.
Thank you. Yes, virtual claps for everybody. We've reached the end of our program. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of our excellent panelists, commentators, excellent moderators. Thank you for the great work that all of the authors have put into this. I could not be more pleased. Thank you all for staying with us over the course of the 2 days, and we hope to see you soon.